A millionaire paid a homeless woman to carry his child, but the delivery room changed everything. Mary Collins had no permanent address, no safety net, and no one waiting for her at the end of the day. She worked quietly, kept her head down, and survived by refusing to be seen as weak. People passed her every day without noticing, until one man did. Arthur Mason, a millionaire CEO, had everything Mary didn't: power, wealth, and a life engineered to avoid risk. After trusting the wrong person once, he rebuilt his world on rules instead of feelings. They weren't supposed to matter to each other. They weren't supposed to cross paths. When their paths crossed through an agreement neither expected to matter, control met humanity, and nothing unfolded the way either of them planned. The city skyline at dusk was a jagged crown of glass and steel, and Arthur Mason owned a significant portion of the jewels within it. From the 42nd floor of his penthouse, the world below looked like a slow-moving simulation, orderly, predictable, and small. Arthur liked it that way. He was a disciplined millionaire who had built his life around precision, contracts, and control. Every chair in his living room was angled to the millimeter. Every book on his shelf was categorized by subject and publication date. For Arthur, silence wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the absence of complication. Years earlier, he had been a different man. He had been married, believing that love and loyalty were strong enough to build a future on. He remembered the warmth of that life, but more vividly, he remembered the coldness of its end. During that marriage, most of his wealth was created. When the relationship fractured, the legal battle that followed was less about a parting of ways and more about a strategic dismantling. The law divided what had been built jointly, leaving Arthur financially diminished and, more importantly, emotionally hardened. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, the reflection of his tailored suit ghosting against the lights of the city. He had sworn he would never let feelings decide his future again, and he built his life to make sure they couldn't. To Arthur, an emotion was a variable he couldn't account for in a spreadsheet. It was a leak in a dam. Now older, wealthier, and far more guarded, Arthur's focus had shifted from accumulation to legacy. He wanted a child, a continuation of his name and his work, but he wanted it on his own terms. He wanted a child without emotional exposure, public risk, or personal vulnerability. For him, certainty equaled safety. Love, he had concluded long ago, was nothing more than a liability. Miles away from the sterile perfection of the Mason penthouse, Mary Collins was finishing her third shift of the day. The industrial lights of the private fertility clinic flickered overhead as she pushed a heavy cleaning cart down the corridor. Mary was a woman who lived in the margins. She had no permanent address, but she carried herself with a dignity that suggested she owned the very floors she scrubbed. Mary hadn't always been in this position. She had once lived a stable life, with a career and a home, but that life had been sacrificed on the altar of her conscience. She had lost everything after refusing to stay silent about misconduct tied to influential institutions. When the dust settled, she found herself blacklisted and unanchored. She was homeless in the legal sense, without a permanent address, but she was far from broken. She survived through temporary work, avoiding dependence and refusing pity. She kept her head down, moving through the clinic like a shadow. She worked quietly, refusing to be seen as weak by those who barely acknowledged her existence. Tonight, the clinic was supposed to be empty, but as she approached the main consultation wing, she saw a man sitting in the waiting area. He looked like he was made of stone, perfectly still, radiating a kind of cold power. This was Arthur Mason. He was there to explore discrete options for his legacy project. Mary didn't know his name or his net worth. She only saw a man who looked like he was waiting for the world to catch up to his schedule. She didn't pause. She simply began her work, cleaning the glass partitions with a methodical rhythm that mirrored Arthur's own obsession with order. The clock on the wall ticked toward 9 p.m. Arthur Mason was not a man who enjoyed waiting. A scheduling complication had delayed his appointment with the clinic director, and his patience was fraying. The receptionist had already left for the evening, and the digital check-in system was flashing a persistent error message. Arthur stood up, his irritation bubbling just beneath the surface of his polished exterior. He approached the desk, ready to find someone to hold accountable, when Mary stepped into his path. She didn't look up at him with the usual wide-eyed deference he was used to from service staff. Instead, she looked at the computer screen, then back at him. "The system resets at 9 for maintenance," Mary said, her voice calm and level. "If you try to bypass it now, you'll lock the office doors. Give me 2 minutes." Without waiting for his permission, she stepped behind the desk. Her movements were professional and self-possessed. She didn't fumble or apologize. She navigated the administrative software with the ease of someone who had learned to solve problems because no one else would do it for her. Within 90 seconds, the printer whirred to life, spitting out his intake forms, and the director's office door clicked open. Arthur watched her, his analytical mind already whirring. Her composure stood out in a world where power was usually met with submission. Most people either stammered in his presence or tried too hard to impress him. This woman, Mary, did neither. She simply resolved the issue without fear. She handed him the papers, her eyes meeting his for a brief, unwavering second, before she returned to her cleaning cart. Curious but methodical, Arthur didn't forget the encounter. The next morning, he didn't call the clinic to complain about the delay. Instead, he requested background information on the staff through his private channels. He wanted to know who the woman was who looked at a millionaire and saw only a broken computer system. "Would you like me to continue with the next 3 chapters, covering the investigation into Mary's past and Arthur's unexpected proposal?" Arthur Mason did not believe in coincidences, he believed in data. Back in the sanctuary of his glass-walled office, he sat before a monitor displaying the results of the background check he had ordered. He wanted to know if the woman from the clinic, Mary Collins, was truly as composed as she appeared, or if it was merely a mask. The files revealed a story of a woman who had once been a pillar of her community. Mary had lived a stable, successful life, but she had lost everything because of her integrity. She had discovered misconduct tied to influential institutions and, despite the personal cost, refused to stay silent. The retaliation had been swift. She was blacklisted, her credit was ruined, and her assets were seized. As Arthur scrolled through the reports, he saw that Mary was currently unhoused by legal definition, lacking a permanent address. Yet she remained entirely self-sufficient. She survived through a rotation of temporary jobs, avoiding any form of dependence or government assistance. She wasn't broken, and she certainly didn't want pity. To Arthur, Mary Collins was a statistical anomaly, a person who could lose everything and still retain her sense of self. In his mind, she was the perfect candidate for his legacy project. She was strong enough to handle the task, yet her lack of a permanent safety net meant she might be open to a purely business-driven arrangement. He saw a way to get what he wanted, a child with the DNA of a survivor, managed through a contract that removed all emotional liability. Arthur didn't approach Mary in a dark alley or at her cleaning job. He did it through the cold, efficient language of law. A week later, Mary was invited to a high-end legal firm, where 2 lawyers and a medical intermediary sat across from her. They presented her with a document thick enough to be a novel, a proposal from an anonymous benefactor, though she knew instinctively it was the man from the clinic. The offer was staggering: full financial support, elite medical care, and a life-changing sum of money upon completion. But the terms were rigid. There would be no relationship, no emotional expectations, and no future obligations once the child was born. It was a transaction of biology, nothing more. Mary read every page. She understood the power imbalance immediately. She wasn't disturbed because she was desperate. She was disturbed because she recognized the sheer weight of what Arthur was asking her to sell. He wasn't just asking for her time, he was asking for her humanity to be paused for 9 months. She looked at the lawyers, her expression unreadable. She knew she could walk away and continue her life of quiet struggle, but she also saw an opportunity to finally regain the stability that had been stolen from her. She didn't sign immediately. Instead, she pushed the paper back toward them with a single, firm correction. "I will not be a line item in a budget," Mary said, her voice cutting through the sterile air of the law office. The lawyers glanced at each other, confused. They were used to people haggling over the dollar amount, not the tone of the contract. Mary explained her condition. She would agree to the terms, but only if Arthur Mason met her face-to-face to finalize it. She required a clause stating that she would be treated with respect, not ownership, throughout the duration of the agreement. Arthur, watching the meeting via a secure video feed, found himself intrigued. Most people in her position would have grabbed the pen before the ink was dry. Her insistence on being treated as a human being, rather than a biological vessel, unsettled his carefully constructed logic. He agreed to the meeting. They met in the same clinic where they had first crossed paths. Arthur stood before her, his hands clasped behind his back. "The contract is designed to protect both of us," Arthur said, his tone clipped. "The contract protects your money and my health," Mary countered. "I want it to protect my dignity. If I am to carry your child, I will not be treated like a ghost in your house." Arthur looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the same unwavering gaze from the night of the computer glitch. He realized that her strength was the very thing he needed for his legacy, even if it was the one thing he couldn't control. He nodded slowly. The amended contract was signed, and the transaction began. The transition from the streets to the Mason estate was a journey between two different planets. Arthur's home was a sprawling achievement of modern architecture, all sharp angles and cold marble. When Mary arrived, she carried only a small bag containing her few possessions, a stark contrast to the vast, empty rooms designed by world-class decorators. Arthur had arranged for a private wing of the house to be hers, stocked with the finest organic foods and medical supplies. However, the atmosphere was thick with a clinical detachment. He treated her presence like an expensive, delicate piece of machinery that required maintenance but no interaction. He would pass her in the hallway with a polite nod, his eyes lingering only long enough to check for any physical signs of the pregnancy's progress. For Mary, the luxury was secondary to the silence. While the bed was soft and the food was plentiful, she felt the weight of the managed process Arthur had envisioned. He had built his life on rules to avoid the risk of feelings, and Mary was currently the largest variable in his house. Yet, Mary refused to play the role of a silent ghost. She began to fill the empty spaces of the house with her own quiet rhythm, reading in the sunroom and moving with a self-possessed grace that Arthur found increasingly difficult to ignore. By the end of the first trimester, the tension between control and humanity began to vibrate through the house. Arthur, who prided himself on precision and contracts, found that Mary's personality did not fit into a spreadsheet. She didn't seek his approval, and she didn't shrink when he entered a room. One evening, Arthur found Mary in the kitchen, preparing a simple meal despite the staff he had hired to cater to her. He stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, watching her move. He had spent years ensuring that love and vulnerability were excluded from his life, viewing them as liabilities. But watching Mary, he felt a strange, unfamiliar tug of respect. "You have a chef for this, Mary," he said, his voice echoing in the minimalist kitchen. "I have a chef for the baby's nutrition, Arthur," she replied without turning around. "I'm making this for myself." There's a difference. Her refusal to disappear into the role of a surrogate unsettled him. He realized that while he had bought her time and her health, he had no claim over her spirit. Without intending to, he began to care, not in the romantic way he had once cared for his wife, but in a raw human way that terrified him. The logic of his contract was beginning to fray at the edges. As Mary's belly grew, so did the complexity of their shared silence. Arthur became obsessed with the medical reports, reviewing every ultrasound and blood test with the scrutiny of a merger and acquisition. He wanted the legacy, the child who would carry his name, but he wanted it without the messiness of a human connection. However, the reality of another person living in his sanctuary changed the energy of the home. Mary brought a sense of groundedness that his wealth couldn't buy. She spoke to the house staff as equals, and she looked at Arthur not as a powerful millionaire, but as a man who was desperately trying to hide behind his bank account. During a late-night encounter in the library, Arthur confessed his fear of risk, mentioning how his previous marriage had left him emotionally and financially diminished. Mary listened, her hand resting on her stomach. "You're trying to build a family out of a contract, Arthur," she said softly. "But a child isn't a business deal. You can't litigate love out of the room." Arthur didn't have an answer. For the first time in years, he felt his belief in total control weakening. He was beginning to realize that the most important things in life were the ones that couldn't be insured. The second trimester brought a change to the atmosphere of the Mason estate that no architect could have designed. Arthur found himself lingering in the common areas more often, his iPad, usually filled with stock tickers and legal briefs, lying forgotten on the marble coffee table. He began to notice the small things, the way Mary hummed a low, soulful melody when she thought she was alone, and the way she tended to the neglected orchids in the conservatory until they bloomed with a defiance that mirrored her own. Arthur's life had been a fortress of solitude by choice, a reaction to the emotional and financial wreckage of his past. Yet, Mary's presence acted like a slow-moving tide, eroding the sharp edges of his isolation. He found himself ordering books she had mentioned in passing, not because he was interested in the subject, but because he wanted to understand the mind of the woman who shared his roof. One afternoon, he watched her from the balcony as she walked through the gardens. She moved with a quiet dignity, her hand habitually resting on the life growing within her, a child that was legally his, but physically hers. He realized then that while the contract dictated the outcome, it could never dictate the journey. For a man who lived by the rule of certainty, this realization was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. The rigidity of Arthur's schedule began to crumble as the pregnancy advanced. He found himself cancelling evening board meetings to ensure he was home for dinner, not because the contract required it, but because the silence of the house felt heavy without Mary's grounded presence. They began to talk, not about medical benchmarks or legal clauses, but about the world outside his gates. Mary spoke of her past, not with the bitterness of a victim, but with the clarity of someone who had faced the fire and remained whole. She told him about the institutional misconduct she had exposed, the price she had paid for her silence, and why she would choose the same path again. Arthur, who had spent a lifetime avoiding risk, found himself humbled by her courage. "You protect your wealth because you're afraid of being small again," Mary said one evening, her eyes reflecting the amber glow of the fireplace. "But Arthur, you're so busy protecting your legacy that you're forgetting to live it." Arthur didn't retreat into his usual coldness. Instead, he sat in the silence she provided, feeling the weight of his own armor for the first time in years. As the third trimester approached, the clinical detachment Arthur had once prized felt increasingly like a lie. He began to accompany Mary to her medical appointments, not as a supervisor checking on an investment, but as a partner in an experience that was becoming deeply personal. He saw the image of the child on the sonogram, a tiny heartbeat pulsing with a rhythm that ignored every legal boundary he had ever drawn. The house staff noticed the change too. The master of the house was no longer a ghost haunting his own halls. He was present, his eyes less focused on the horizon and more on the woman standing in front of him. Mary, too, seemed to soften, though she never lost the fierce independence that had first caught his attention. One night, a sudden storm rolled over the city, shaking the glass walls of the penthouse. Arthur found Mary in the kitchen, staring out at the rain. Without thinking, he placed a hand over hers on the counter. It was the first time they had touched outside of a medical context. The contact was brief, but it signaled a shift that couldn't be undone. The contract was still in the safe, but the people who had signed it were no longer the same. As the final weeks of the pregnancy arrived, a heavy, expectant quiet settled over the Mason estate. The sharp, clinical atmosphere that had once defined the house was replaced by an almost electric tension. Arthur found himself working from home more frequently, his vast office sitting empty while he paced the hallways of the wing where Mary lived. He told himself he was merely protecting his investment, but his heart, long since hardened against such things, knew better. Mary moved slower now, the physical weight of the child she carried finally beginning to catch up with her iron will. Yet, even in her physical vulnerability, she remained the most powerful presence in the house. She refused Arthur's constant offers of additional staff, preferring to maintain the autonomy that had kept her spirit intact when she had nothing else. The nursery was finished, a room of soft greys and warm woods, devoid of the cold glass and steel that filled the rest of the penthouse. Arthur stood in the doorway one evening, looking at the crib. He had engineered this entire situation to avoid risk, but standing there, He realized that the biggest risk of all was the one he hadn't planned for, the risk of caring about the woman who was bringing his legacy into the world. The walls Arthur had built around his life were not just cracking, they were beginning to crumble. He found himself watching Mary not with the analytical eye of a millionaire managing a contract, but with the raw concern of a man who realized he was no longer in control. He began to ask her questions about her future, not the future dictated by the legal documents, but what she actually wanted for herself once the agreement was fulfilled. Mary's answers were always grounded in the reality she had lived. She spoke of opening a small community center or returning to the advocacy work that had cost her so much. She never spoke of the money Arthur owed her as a windfall, but as a tool to reclaim her voice. "You're waiting for the day this ends so you can go back to your rules," Mary said to him during a quiet dinner. "But you've already broken the most important one, Arthur. You've let yourself see me." Arthur didn't deny it. For a man who had sworn that love was a liability, the realization that he felt a deep human responsibility toward her was a terrifying revelation. The delivery date loomed like a storm on the horizon. Arthur had every detail managed: the private floor of the hospital, the elite team of doctors, and the legal intermediaries ready to finalize the paperwork the moment the child took its first breath. Everything was precise, legal, and controlled. But Mary, ever the disruptor of his order, seemed to grow more contemplative as the time drew near. She spent hours in the nursery, not looking at the furniture, but staring out the window at the city where she had once been invisible. She knew that the contract promised she would be treated with respect, but she also knew that trust could not be promised into existence. One night, Arthur found her there in the dark. He didn't turn on the lights. He simply stood beside her. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "No," Mary replied, her voice steady. "I've been through worse than a delivery room. I'm just wondering if you're ready for what happens when your rules don't work anymore." Arthur didn't have an answer then, but the answer would find him sooner than he expected. Before we dive deeper, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Thank you. Back to the story. The meticulously planned timeline shattered at 3 o'clock in the morning. Arthur was jolted awake not by an alarm, but by the frantic sound of footsteps in the hallway, a sound that didn't belong in his world of regulated silence. He found Mary leaning against the doorframe of her suite, her face pale and her breathing shallow. The suddenness of labor had bypassed the early stages, moving with a biological ferocity that no legal document could have anticipated. Within minutes, the high-performance vehicles were racing through the rain-slicked streets toward the hospital. Arthur sat in the back with Mary, watching the city lights blur into streaks of neon. He realized that for all his wealth and the elite medical team waiting for them, he was completely powerless against the force of nature unfolding beside him. The control he had engineered over his life felt like a paper shield in a hurricane. As they were ushered into the private delivery suite, the atmosphere shifted from expectant to urgent. The monitors, which Arthur expected to show steady, rhythmic pulses, began to beep with a frantic, irregular tempo. The medical team, usually so composed in Arthur's presence, began to move with a hurried precision that signaled something was wrong. The managed process was spiraling into a crisis. The delivery room was a blur of blue scrubs and sharp white light. The lead obstetrician, a man Arthur had paid a fortune for his expertise, pulled him aside into the hushed corridor. The words he spoke were cold and heavy. A sudden medical emergency had developed, a complication that placed both lives in immediate jeopardy. "Mr. Mason," the doctor said, his voice stripped of its usual professional warmth, "the situation is critical. We are facing a narrow window where we may have to prioritize one life over the other. We need to know, do we prioritize the child or do we save Mary?" The question hung in the air, a direct challenge to the very foundation of Arthur's world. His entire reason for this arrangement was the child, his legacy, his bloodline, the continuation of his name without the liability of emotional connection. According to the logic of the contract, the child was the asset, and Mary was the provider of a service. But as he looked through the glass at Mary, a woman who had challenged him, respected him, and forced him to see his own loneliness, the logic of the contract turned to ash. There was no consultation with lawyers. There was no weighing of financial outcomes or legacy projections. Without hesitation, Arthur looked the doctor in the eye, and spoke with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. "Save Mary," he said. "The child is a hope, but Mary is a person. Save her." The decision was a total surrender of the control he had spent a decade building. It was a choice that prioritized a human connection over a calculated outcome, breaking the logic of the agreement he had signed. He waited in the hallway, the silence now heavy with the weight of his choice. He realized that he didn't care about the wealth he had protected or the legacy he had sought. He only cared about the survival of the woman who had walked into his life and refused to be a ghost. Hours passed in a vacuum of uncertainty. Finally, the doors opened. Both Mary and the child survived, but the world they were entering was no longer defined by the terms of a legal document. What began as a cold transaction had been irreversibly transformed in the crucible of that choice. Arthur sat by Mary's bed as she drifted into a restorative sleep, realizing that while he had been trying to buy a future, he had accidentally found a soul. The sterile white of the recovery suite felt different now. The sun rose over the city, casting long golden fingers across the room where Mary lay. Both Mary and the child had survived the ordeal, a miracle that defied the grim odds presented only hours before. Arthur sat in the armchair by the window, his expensive suit wrinkled, his eyes heavy with a fatigue that no amount of caffeine could touch. When Mary finally opened her eyes, she didn't look at the monitors or the high-end amenities of the private floor. She looked at Arthur. The doctor had already informed her of the crisis and the choice Arthur had made. The decision irreversibly broke the logic of the contract. For a woman who had spent years being treated as a problem to be solved or a person to be ignored, the weight of being chosen over a legacy was profound. Arthur tried to speak, to retreat back into the safety of his professional demeanor, but the words wouldn't come. The transaction was dead. What remained was two people who had seen the absolute limit of what control could buy and what humanity required. He had chosen her life over his own carefully engineered plan, and in doing so, he had finally become the man he was before the world hardened him. Recovery was a slow process of reclaiming strength. As Mary grew stronger, the distance between her and the world Arthur had built began to reappear, not as a barrier, but as a boundary. She held the child, a perfect bridge between their two lives, but she knew that staying in the Mason estate under the shadow of the old agreement was impossible. "You saved me, Arthur," she said one afternoon, her voice steady and clear, "and for that I will always be grateful. But I can't stay here as a guest in a house where I was once a contract." Arthur wanted to argue. He wanted to offer her more money, more security, more clauses to make her stay. But he realized that Mary's strength came from her independence. She had survived the streets by refusing to be a dependent, and she wouldn't start now. After recovering, Mary left, not in anger, but in clarity. She understood that trust cannot be promised into existence. It has to be earned through time and consistency. She walked out of the glass tower with her dignity intact, leaving Arthur alone in a home that now felt far too large and far too quiet. With Mary gone, the Mason estate returned to its state of perfect, orderly silence. But the silence was different now. It was no longer peaceful, it was empty. Arthur went back to his meetings and his spreadsheets, but the data felt hollow. Every time he looked at the empty nursery or the garden where Mary used to walk, he was reminded that he had won his life back but lost the only person who truly saw him. He realized that his wealth was a fortress that had kept everyone out, including himself. The contract was fulfilled, the money was paid, and the legal obligations were settled. But what began as a transaction could no longer be contained by legal terms. He found himself thinking about the child, not as a legacy or a continuation of his name, but as a human being who deserved a mother who was there by choice, not by debt. Arthur spent months in introspection. He didn't use his private investigators to hunt her down, or his lawyers to exert leverage. He knew that if he wanted Mary back, it couldn't be through power. It had to be through something he had spent his whole life avoiding: accountability and the slow, patient work of building a relationship without a safety net. Arthur Mason's world was no longer defined by the high-velocity movements of the stock market or the rigid structure of legal agreements. For months, he operated in a state of quiet accountability, He didn't use his wealth to overwhelm Mary or his power to force a meeting. Instead, he sought her out with a consistency that mirrored the way she had once lived her life, with quiet, unwavering truth. He finally found her in a modest neighborhood, working at the community center she had always dreamed of opening. She was no longer a woman in the margins. She was the center of a world she had built with her own hands and the funds she had earned. When Arthur appeared, he didn't bring a new contract or a team of lawyers. He brought only himself, stripped of the armor of his status. "I didn't come to talk about the past," Arthur said, standing in the doorway of her office. "I came to show you that I've learned what it means to be responsible for someone other than myself." He didn't ask her to come back to the estate. He simply asked for the chance to be present. For the first time, Arthur was operating without leverage, relying entirely on the hope that his actions over the past few months had spoken louder than his old rules. Mary watched him, her gaze as discerning and composed as the night they first met. She saw a man who had finally understood that trust cannot be purchased. It must be earned through sacrifice and restraint. She saw that Arthur had not come to reclaim an asset, but to reconcile with a human being. Over the following weeks, Arthur didn't try to buy her affection. He showed up when he said he would. He listened without trying to solve her problems. He respected the boundaries she had set, proving that he finally understood the difference between ownership and partnership. Mary realized that the man standing before her was no longer the architect of silence, but a man who was finally comfortable with the beautiful messiness of life. Eventually, the clarity Mary had sought led her to a new conclusion. Trust, while it couldn't be promised into existence, could be built on the ruins of a broken contract. This time, when she agreed to enter Arthur's life again, it wasn't because of a financial need or a legal obligation. She returned by choice, choosing to build something new on the foundation of the accountability he had shown. What began as a cold, calculated transaction ended in a profound surrender of ego. The Mason estate was no longer a gallery of expensive, untouchable things. It became a home filled with the noise and unpredictability of a growing child. The sharp angles of Arthur's life were softened by the presence of a woman who refused to let him hide behind his wealth. They didn't build their new life on the old contract, which remained in the safe as a reminder of where they started. Instead, they built a family on sacrifice, restraint, and earned trust. Arthur Mason had set out to secure a legacy through precision and control, but he ended up finding a future through the very thing he had once feared most, humanity. In the end, the millionaire and the woman who had once been invisible created a world where power was met with respect, and rules were replaced by love. The delivery room had changed everything, not by following a plan, but by forcing a man to choose between his pride and his soul. And in choosing Mary, he had finally saved himself. Arthur Mason thought he could buy a future, but he ended up finding something money could never touch: a soul. Mary's strength didn't come from a bank account, but from her refusal to be invisible. Their story reminds us that while contracts protect our assets, only trust can protect our hearts. If this story touched you, show your support by hitting that like button. It helps us tell more stories of humanity and second chances. What would you have done if you were in Arthur's shoes in that delivery room? Would you have made the same choice? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one of them. And if you want to be the first to hear our next incredible story, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on all notifications. You won't want to miss what we have coming next. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.